Captain Marcus Hartwell had served the Royal Guard for 15 years. His weathered hands gripped the ceremonial sword at his side as he stood at attention outside the palace training grounds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard where new recruits practiced their drills. Marcus watched the 4 newest additions to the Guard with growing concern. James Crawford, tall and arrogant with perfectly polished armor, seemed to think his noble family name made him superior to everyone else. Beside him stood Derek Mills, a stocky man who laughed too loudly at his own crude jokes. The 3rd recruit, Nathan Pierce, had cold eyes that never seemed to blink, always watching and calculating. The 4th, Thomas Reed, was the worst of them all, a bully who enjoyed making others uncomfortable with his sneering comments. These 4 had been assigned to Marcus's unit 3 weeks ago, and already he could see the problems brewing. They whispered among themselves during training, shot hostile glances at the older guards, and seemed to take pleasure in making mistakes that would get their fellow soldiers in trouble. Prince George, now 17 years old, often visited the training grounds. The young prince had grown into a thoughtful teenager, though he still preferred books to sword fighting. Marcus had been assigned as his personal protector 2 years ago, and in that time he had developed genuine respect for the boy who would one day be king. On this particular morning, Prince George arrived early for his weekly observation of guard training. He wore simple brown clothes instead of his royal attire, preferring to blend in rather than stand out. Marcus noticed how the prince's eyes immediately found the 4 recruits, and how his expression grew troubled. "Good morning, Captain Hartwell," Prince George said quietly, joining Marcus at the edge of the training ground. "Your Highness," Marcus replied with a respectful nod. "The morning drills are just beginning." The recruits were practicing sword formations under the instruction of Sergeant William Torres, a gruff man with 30 years of experience. Marcus watched as the 4 newcomers deliberately broke formation, causing confusion among the other trainees. "Again!" Sergeant Torres shouted, his face red with frustration. "Hold your positions!" James Crawford smirked and whispered something to Derek Mills, who chuckled. Nathan Pierce's cold stare fixed on Marcus, while Thomas Reed made an exaggerated show of stumbling, knocking into a younger recruit named Peter Walsh. Peter was only 16, smaller than the others, but he worked twice as hard as anyone else. He had joined the Guard to support his widowed mother and 3 younger sisters. Marcus had taken a liking to the boy, seeing potential in his determination and honest character. "Sorry," Thomas Reed said with mock concern as Peter picked himself up from the ground. "Maybe you should practice walking before you try sword fighting." The other 3 recruits laughed, and Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Prince George stepped forward slightly, his young face showing anger at the display of cruelty. "Those 4 seem to enjoy causing trouble," the prince observed quietly. Marcus nodded. "They've been testing boundaries since they arrived, Your Highness. I've been documenting their behavior for review." As the morning progressed, the situation grew worse. During water breaks, the 4 recruits cornered Peter Walsh near the equipment shed. Marcus was across the courtyard, helping another trainee with his sword grip when he heard raised voices. "Look at the little boy trying to play soldier," James Crawford taunted, pushing Peter backward. "Maybe he should go home to his mama," Derek Mills added, grabbing Peter's training sword and tossing it aside. Nathan Pierce stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "We don't think you belong here, Walsh. This isn't a place for weak children." Thomas Reed cracked his knuckles menacingly. "Perhaps we should help you understand that message." Peter stood his ground, though Marcus could see the fear in his eyes from across the courtyard. "I have as much right to be here as anyone," the young recruit said, his voice shaking but determined. "Rights?" James laughed harshly. "Your family probably can't even afford proper boots. Look at those worn-out things you're wearing." Marcus began walking quickly toward the group, but Prince George was already moving. The young prince had been closer to the shed and reached the confrontation first. "Is there a problem here?" Prince George asked calmly, though his voice carried an authority that made all 4 recruits freeze. James Crawford recovered first, putting on a false smile. "Your Highness, we were just having a friendly conversation with Walsh here about training techniques." "It didn't sound very friendly," Prince George replied, his eyes moving from one recruit to another. "And it certainly didn't look like a discussion about training." Derek Mills shifted uncomfortably. "We were just suggesting that perhaps Walsh might be more suited to other work." "What kind of other work?" Prince George asked, his tone growing colder. Nathan Pierce spoke up, his calculating eyes studying the prince. "Kitchen work, perhaps, stable cleaning, something more appropriate for his background." Thomas Reed nodded eagerly. "Exactly, Your Highness. We're just looking out for the standards of the Royal Guard." Marcus finally reached the group, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Recruits, return to formation immediately." "Of course, Captain," James Crawford said smoothly. "We were just finishing our discussion." But Prince George wasn't finished. He looked directly at Peter Walsh, who stood with his shoulders squared despite the intimidation he had just faced. "Tell me, Walsh," the prince said, "why did you join the Royal Guard?" Peter glanced nervously at the 4 recruits, then back at Prince George. "To serve the crown, Your Highness, and to provide for my family." "And how long have you been training?" 6 months, Your Highness." Prince George nodded thoughtfully. "Captain Hartwell, how would you rate Walsh's progress?" Marcus straightened. "He's one of our most dedicated trainees, Your Highness. Always punctual, always prepared, and he's shown remarkable improvement in combat skills." The 4 recruits exchanged glances, clearly unhappy with this turn of events. "Interesting," Prince George said. "It seems to me that dedication and improvement are exactly the standards we want in the Royal Guard." He looked directly at James Crawford. "Wouldn't you agree?" James forced another smile. "Of course, Your Highness. We all want the best for the Guard." "Then I'm sure you'll be supportive of Walsh's continued training," Prince George said. It wasn't a question. The tension in the air was thick as the 4 recruits nodded reluctantly. Marcus could see the anger simmering beneath their respectful facades, and he knew this confrontation was far from over. As the group dispersed back to training, Prince George lingered beside Marcus. "Captain, I want to be informed of any further incidents involving those 4 recruits." "Of course, Your Highness." "And Captain?" Prince George's voice was quiet but firm. "Walsh seems like exactly the kind of person we want protecting the realm. Make sure he gets the support he needs." Marcus watched as the prince walked away, impressed once again by the young man's character. But he also noticed how the 4 recruits watched Prince George's departure with dark expressions, and he felt a chill of foreboding about what might come next. 3 days after the confrontation at the training grounds, the situation began to escalate in ways Captain Marcus Hartwell had feared. The 4 recruits had grown more careful about their public behavior, but Marcus could sense the growing hostility beneath their forced politeness. It started with small acts of sabotage. Peter Walsh's equipment would mysteriously go missing right before inspections. His armor straps would be loosened just enough to cause problems during drills. His sword would be dulled overnight, making him appear unprepared during weapon maintenance checks. Marcus tried to stay close to Peter during training sessions, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. His duties as captain required him to oversee all aspects of guard operations, not just watch over one recruit. Still, he made sure Peter knew he had support. "Don't let them break your spirit, son," Marcus told Peter privately after another incident where the young recruit's helmet had been filled with mud. "They want you to quit. Don't give them that satisfaction." Peter nodded, cleaning the mud from his helmet with determination. "I won't quit, sir. My family is depending on me." Meanwhile, James Crawford had been busy building alliances among some of the other recruits. His family's wealth and connections gave him influence, and he used it skillfully. He would buy drinks for guards after training, tell stories about his family's military history, and gradually plant seeds of doubt about Peter's worthiness. "I'm not saying Walsh is a bad person," Marcus overheard him telling a group of recruits one evening. "I'm just saying that the guard has always maintained certain standards. When you lower those standards for one person, where does it end?" Derek Mills was more direct in his approach. He spread rumors about Peter's family, claiming they were in debt to unsavory people. "I heard his mother owes money to some dangerous characters," he would whisper during mess hall conversations. "What happens when those people come looking for payment? Will Peter's loyalty be to the crown or to protecting his family?" Nathan Pierce worked more subtly, asking pointed questions during training sessions that were designed to make Peter look foolish. "Walsh," he would say during combat drills, "what would you do if an enemy had a hostage? Would you risk the hostage's life to complete your mission?" These questions weren't necessarily inappropriate for training, but Nathan asked them in a way that made Peter's answers seem inadequate no matter how he responded. If Peter showed concern for civilians, Nathan would suggest he wasn't committed to his duties. If Peter emphasized mission completion, Nathan would imply he was heartless. Thomas Reed remained the most direct threat. He would shoulder-check Peter in hallways, step on his feet during formation, and make threatening gestures when he thought no one was looking. His intimidation was physical and constant. The breaking point came during a night training exercise in the palace gardens. The recruits were practicing stealth movement and surveillance techniques under the cover of darkness. Marcus was observing from a hidden position, evaluating their progress. Peter had been assigned to patrol the eastern section of the gardens, near the ornamental maze where Prince George often walked during his evening contemplations. It was a crucial area that required careful attention, and Marcus was pleased to see Peter taking his assignment seriously. But the four troublesome recruits had other plans. James Crawford approached Peter's position first, emerging from behind a large oak tree. "Walsh," he called softly. "Sergeant Torres wants to see you at the main gate." Peter hesitated. "I'm supposed to maintain position here until the exercise ends." "Orders changed," Derek Mills said, appearing from another direction. "Captain Hartwell sent new instructions." Nathan Pierce and Thomas Reed completed the circle around Peter, all four recruits now surrounding the younger guard in the shadows of the garden. Peter looked around nervously. "If orders changed, why didn't I receive them through proper channels?" "Because," Thomas Reed said, his voice turning menacing, "this isn't about orders anymore." James Crawford stepped closer, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "We've tried to handle this politely, Walsh, but you don't seem to understand. You don't belong here?" "The prince might have protected you the other day," Derek Mills added, "but he's not here now." Marcus, watching from his concealed position, began moving quickly toward the confrontation, but he was too far away to intervene immediately. Nathan Pierce's voice was cold and calculating. "We've been talking to the other recruits, Walsh. They agree with us. You're bringing down the standards of the entire unit." Peter backed against a garden wall, his hand moving to his own sword. "I haven't done anything wrong. My training scores are good, my conduct record is clean." "Your scores don't matter," Thomas Reed snarled. "When you don't have the breeding for this job, this isn't about what you can do, it's about who you are." "And who I am," James Crawford said with aristocratic disdain, "is someone whose family has served the crown for generations. We know what it means to uphold honor and tradition." The four recruits began closing in, and Marcus could see that Peter was trapped. The young recruit drew his sword, but he was outnumbered and surrounded. "This is your last chance, Walsh," Derek Mills threatened. "Resign from the guard tonight, or we'll make sure you're removed in a way that's much less pleasant." "I won't resign," Peter said firmly, despite the fear in his voice. "I earned my place here." Thomas Reed laughed harshly. "Earned? You think showing up and trying hard earns you anything? You're nothing but a commoner playing dress-up in armor that better men should wear." That's when Prince George stepped out of the shadows. The prince had been walking in the gardens, as was his evening habit, when he heard voices near the maze. He had approached quietly to investigate, arriving just in time to witness the entire confrontation. "I disagree," Prince George said calmly, though his voice carried unmistakable authority. All 5 recruits spun around, their faces showing various degrees of shock, fear, and embarrassment. James Crawford recovered first, attempting to salvage the situation. "Your Highness, we were just conducting additional training exercises." "Training exercises?" Prince George stepped into the circle, positioning himself between Peter and the 4 recruits. "It sounded more like bullying to me." Derek Mills shifted nervously. "We were testing Walsh's resolve under pressure, Your Highness. It's important that guards be prepared for intimidation tactics." Prince George's eyes were cold as ice. "And who authorized this test? Captain Hartwell? Sergeant Torres?" The 4 recruits exchanged glances, unable to answer. "I see," Prince George continued. "So you took it upon yourselves to surround a fellow guard in the darkness, threaten him, and demand his resignation. Tell me, how exactly does that serve the crown?" Nathan Pierce tried a different approach. "Your Highness, we're concerned about maintaining the traditions and standards of the Royal Guard. Walsh's background—" "What about his background?" Prince George interrupted sharply. "He's not from a military family," James Crawford said. "He lacks the proper breeding for this position." Prince George was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see the prince's anger building. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but deadly serious. "Let me tell you about breeding," the prince said slowly. "My ancestor, King Edmund the Just, was a blacksmith's son who earned his crown through courage and wisdom. The greatest knights in our history came from farms and villages, not noble houses. Honor isn't inherited, gentlemen. It's earned." The 4 recruits stood in stunned silence. "And as for Walsh's qualifications," Prince George continued, "I've been watching the training exercises. I've seen his dedication, his improvement, and his character. He represents exactly what I want in the people who protect this realm." Thomas Reed made a last, desperate attempt to maintain their position. "Your Highness, we only want what's best for—" "What's best?" Prince George cut him off. "Is that you 4 return to your quarters immediately and report to Captain Hartwell first thing in the morning for disciplinary review." The dismissal was clear and final. One by one, the 4 recruits saluted reluctantly and began walking back toward the palace, their intimidation campaign having backfired spectacularly. Prince George watched them go, then turned to Peter, who was still standing against the garden wall with his sword drawn. "Are you all right, Walsh?" Peter sheathed his sword and straightened. "Yes, Your Highness. Thank you." "You handled yourself well," Prince George said. "You didn't back down even when outnumbered." "I couldn't, Your Highness. This position means everything to my family." Prince George nodded understanding. "Captain Hartwell will be here shortly," he said, having noticed Marcus approaching through the gardens. "Make sure you tell him exactly what happened here tonight." As Marcus finally reached them, Prince George placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Remember, Walsh, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite your fear. You showed real courage tonight." But as Peter thanked the prince and Marcus began asking questions about the incident, none of them realized that the 4 recruits hadn't gone directly back to their quarters, as ordered. Instead, they had gathered in an empty storage room in the palace basement, and their anger was now focused entirely on a new target, Prince George himself. The disciplinary hearing took place the following morning in Captain Marcus Hartwell's office. The 4 recruits stood at attention while Marcus reviewed the incident report. Their faces showed a mixture of defiance and barely contained rage. According to multiple witnesses, Marcus read from his notes. You four surrounded Recruit Walsh in an isolated area, threatened him, and demanded his resignation without any authorization from command. James Crawford stepped forward. Sir, we were concerned about unit cohesion and— You were concerned, Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp as steel, about nothing that falls under your authority as recruits. You acted without orders, endangered a fellow guard, and brought dishonor to your positions. Derek Mills tried to interject. Captain, we only wanted— What you wanted, Marcus cut him off, was to intimidate someone you perceived as inferior. That behavior is unacceptable in the Royal Guard. Nathan Pierce spoke next, his cold eyes fixed on Marcus. And what about the prince's interference? Isn't it unusual for royalty to involve themselves in guard discipline? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt his anger rising at the implied criticism of Prince George, but he kept his voice controlled. His Highness was taking his evening walk when he encountered what appeared to be an assault in progress, Marcus replied firmly. Any member of the royal family has not only the right but the duty to intervene when they witness misconduct. Thomas Reed's face twisted with resentment. So the prince gets to decide who belongs in the guard now. What happens when he's not around to protect his favorite? Marcus stood up slowly, his presence suddenly filling the room. That comment, Reed, just earned you an additional week of disciplinary duty. Would you care to dig yourself deeper? The four recruits exchanged glances, and Marcus could see the dangerous thoughts forming behind their eyes. Your punishment, Marcus announced, is as follows. 2 weeks of additional duty, cleaning the armory and stables, loss of your next month's wages, and you will write formal apologies to Recruit Walsh. This is unfair, James Crawford said, his aristocratic composure finally cracking. Our families have served the crown for generations. We shouldn't be punished for upholding standards. Your family's service, Marcus replied coldly, makes your behavior even more shameful. You dishonored their legacy along with your own. As the recruits filed out of his office, Marcus noticed the looks they gave each other. There was something different in their expressions now, something that worried him deeply. Their anger had shifted beyond Peter Walsh to something more dangerous. Over the next few days, Marcus watched the four recruits carefully. They completed their punishment duties without complaint, wrote their required apologies, and maintained proper military behavior during all official activities. But there was something calculating about their compliance that made Marcus uneasy. Prince George continued his regular visits to the training grounds, unaware of the growing resentment focused on him. Marcus noticed how the four recruits watched the prince now, their eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that seemed anything but respectful. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon during advanced combat training. The recruits were practicing close-quarters combat in the palace's lower training hall, a stone-walled chamber with limited exits. Marcus was supervising the session when a messenger arrived with urgent documents requiring his immediate attention. Sergeant Torres, Marcus called to his second-in-command. Take over the session. I'll return shortly. As Marcus left the training hall, he didn't notice the meaningful looks exchanged between the four recruits. Prince George had planned to observe the combat training, as he often did when his afternoon studies were completed. He entered the training hall just as Sergeant Torres was called away to handle an equipment malfunction in the armory, leaving the recruits to continue their practice unsupervised. The timing was no coincidence. Prince George stood near the entrance, watching the sparring matches with interest. Most of the recruits continued their drills normally, but the four troublemakers slowly maneuvered themselves into position around the prince. It started subtly. James Crawford, accidentally, bumped into Peter Walsh during a sword exercise, sending him stumbling into another recruit. Derek Mills called out incorrect commands that caused confusion among the trainees. Nathan Pierce deliberately knocked over a rack of practice weapons, creating noise and distraction. Thomas Reed was the one who made the first direct move toward Prince George. Your Highness, he said, approaching with his sword still drawn from practice. "Could I ask for your opinion on a technique?" Prince George, always willing to engage with the guard's training, stepped forward. "Of course. What technique?" That's when the 4 recruits smoothly surrounded him. It happened so quickly that the other trainees, focused on their own exercises, didn't immediately notice. James Crawford moved to block the prince's path to the main exit. Derek Mills positioned himself near the side door. Nathan Pierce stepped behind Prince George, while Thomas Reed stayed in front. "Actually, Your Highness," Thomas Reed said, his voice taking on a menacing tone, "we wanted to discuss something more personal." Prince George immediately understood the danger. He glanced around the training hall, noting the positions of the other recruits and calculating his options. Most of the others were too far away to help quickly, and they were still unaware of what was happening. "What did you want to discuss?" Prince George asked calmly, though his hand moved instinctively toward the ceremonial dagger at his belt. James Crawford smiled coldly. "We wanted to talk about your interference in guard business. It seems you've developed some incorrect ideas about your role here." "My role," Prince George replied steadily, "is to ensure the Royal Guard upholds the values of honor and justice that protect this realm." Derek Mills laughed harshly. "Your role is to stay out of matters you don't understand. You're just a boy playing at being important." The insult to the prince caused several nearby recruits to stop their exercises and turn toward the confrontation. Peter Walsh, who had been sparring at the far end of the hall, noticed the situation first. Nathan Pierce stepped closer to Prince George, his practice sword still in his hand. "You cost us our wages, our dignity, and our standing in the guard, all to protect some worthless commoner who shouldn't be here." "Walsh has earned his place through hard work and dedication," Prince George said firmly. "Something you 4 seem to lack." Thomas Reed's face darkened with rage. "Earned? He's earned nothing. Just like you've earned nothing except an accident of birth that put a crown on your family's heads." The treasonous words echoed through the training hall, and now all the recruits had stopped their exercises to stare at the confrontation. Prince George's voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable authority. "You're all relieved of duty. Report to Captain Hartwell immediately." "We don't think so," James Crawford said, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "We think it's time someone taught you what real power looks like." That's when Peter Walsh acted. The young recruit had been moving quietly around the edge of the training hall while the 4 conspirators focused on the prince. Now he was close enough to intervene, but he was still outnumbered 4-1. "Leave the prince alone," Peter called out, drawing his practice sword as he stepped into the circle. Derek Mills turned toward him with a sneer. "Look who wants to play hero. The little commoner thinks he can protect royalty." "I think," Peter said steadily, "that threatening the prince is treason, and I swore an oath to protect the crown." Nathan Pierce laughed. "Your oath means nothing. You're nothing." "Just like your pathetic family." The cruel words about his family sparked something in Peter's eyes, but he kept his focus on protecting Prince George. Thomas Reed raised his sword menacingly. 4 against 2 now, Walsh. Still think you can win?" But Peter's brave stand had an unexpected effect. Other recruits in the hall began moving toward the confrontation, their own swords drawn. They might not all like Peter personally, but they understood their duty to protect the prince. "Actually," said Robert Miller, a veteran recruit who had served for 3 years, "it looks more like 4 against 15. More guards were entering the hall, having heard the commotion. The 4 conspirators found themselves increasingly outnumbered as loyal guards surrounded them. James Crawford's aristocratic confidence began to waver as he realized their plan was falling apart. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "Yes, it is," Prince George said firmly. "You 4 have committed treason in front of witnesses. Your careers in the Royal Guard are finished." At that moment, Captain Marcus Hartwell burst into the training hall, having been alerted by a runner about the disturbance. He took in the scene instantly, the 4 recruits with drawn weapons surrounding the prince, Peter Walsh standing protectively nearby, and the other guards forming a defensive circle. "Drop your weapons!" Marcus commanded, his own sword appearing in his hand with lightning speed. Faced with overwhelming opposition and certain court-martial, the 4 recruits finally surrendered their swords. As guards moved to arrest the conspirators, Prince George placed a hand on Peter Walsh's shoulder. "Thank you, Walsh," the prince said quietly. "You put yourself at risk to protect me." Peter straightened with pride. "It's my duty, Your Highness, and my honor." Later, as the 4 former recruits were led away in chains, Prince George spoke privately with Captain Hartwell. "Captain, I want Walsh promoted to full guard status immediately. He's proven his loyalty and courage beyond any doubt." Marcus nodded with satisfaction. "I couldn't agree more, Your Highness. He's exactly the kind of man we want protecting the crown." "And, Captain," Prince George added with a slight smile, "the next time someone questions whether Walsh belongs in the Royal Guard, you can remind them that he was willing to stand alone against 4 armed men to protect his prince. That kind of courage and loyalty can't be bought, inherited, or faked. It has to come from the heart." As they watched Peter Walsh receive congratulations from his fellow guards, both Prince George and Captain Hartwell knew they had witnessed something special. A young man from humble beginnings had proven that true nobility comes not from bloodlines or wealth, but from character, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. The Royal Guard was stronger for having him, and the kingdom was safer for having people like Peter Walsh willing to stand guard over its future.